Picture this. You're standing in the grand court of a medieval palace, watching what appears to be the most unlikely ruler in history take their throne. The courtiers whisper behind jeweled fans, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. Before them sits someone who defies every convention of royal power, a figure whose very existence challenges everything society believes about leadership, gender, and authority. This isn't just another tale of political intrigue. This is the story of how one person transformed from society's greatest joke into its most feared leader, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or an army, but the courage to be exactly who you are. Before we dive into this extraordinary journey of transformation and triumph, if you're fascinated by stories that reveal the hidden truths about power and identity throughout history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales like this one. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it amazing that we're exploring these forgotten stories together, from all corners of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the remarkable people who dared to be different. What you're about to discover isn't just another royal biography, it's a masterclass in how perception becomes reality, how mockery can become respect, and how someone dismissed as a freak of nature can rise to command the loyalty of thousands. The name you'll learn today might not be familiar, but their strategy for turning weakness into strength will change how you think about power forever. Let's begin with the moment that would define everything, the day a young person looked in a mirror and made a decision that would either destroy them or make them legendary. Growing up in a world where your very appearance marks you as an outcast isn't just difficult, it's a daily battle for survival. Every morning brought the same cruel reality, a face that didn't fit the rigid expectations of medieval society, features that made people cross themselves and whisper prayers. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Instead of hiding, instead of accepting the role of victim that society had prepared, our protagonist made a choice that stunned everyone. They decided to weaponize the very thing that made them different. They turned their greatest source of shame into their most powerful tool. The medieval world was obsessed with signs and omens. People believed that physical appearance reflected divine judgment, that unusual features marked someone as either blessed or cursed by God himself. In a society where your face could determine your fate, being different wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Religious authorities taught that physical abnormalities were punishments for sin, marks of divine displeasure that branded their bearer as unworthy of respect or power. This belief system created a cruel hierarchy where conventional beauty equaled moral worth, where smooth skin meant a pure soul, and where any deviation from the norm suggested corruption within. For someone whose appearance challenged these assumptions, survival required either complete invisibility or something far more dangerous, complete visibility. Our protagonist chose visibility, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of begging for acceptance or trying to hide their differences, they began to cultivate an image so striking, so deliberately provocative, that people couldn't look away. They understood something that modern psychology has since confirmed, that attention, even negative attention, can be transformed into influence if you're strategic enough to control the narrative. The first step was mastering the art of presentation. While others tried to blend in, our future ruler learned to stand out in ways that commanded respect rather than just curiosity. They studied how successful leaders carried themselves, how they used their voices, how they made others feel both privileged and slightly intimidated to be in their presence. But they also added something uniquely their own, an element of mystery that made people desperate to understand them. Ancient texts describe their early public appearances as theatrical masterpieces. They didn't just enter a room, they made an entrance that left everyone discussing their presence long after they'd departed. They wore clothing that emphasized rather than concealed their distinctive features, turning what others saw as flaws into symbols of something otherworldly and powerful. But appearance was only the beginning. True power required substance, and our protagonist spent years developing the skills that would eventually make them indispensable. They became a student of human nature, learning to read people's desires and fears with supernatural accuracy. They mastered languages, studied military strategy, and cultivated relationships with individuals who would later become crucial allies. What's fascinating is how they handled the ridicule that followed them everywhere. Instead of responding with anger or defensiveness, they developed a technique that completely disarmed their critics. They embraced the mockery and transformed it into mystique. When people called them unnatural, they agreed and suggested this made them closer to the divine. When others whispered about their strange appearance, they began telling stories about prophetic dreams and supernatural visions that their unique features allowed them to receive. This wasn't just clever marketing, it was psychological warfare of the highest order. By refusing to be ashamed of what made them different, they forced others to question their own assumptions about power and authority. People began to wonder if perhaps this unusual figure possessed knowledge or abilities that conventional leaders lacked. The transformation from outcast to influential figure didn't happen overnight, but when it began, the momentum was unstoppable. Our protagonist had learned the most important lesson about power, that it's not about what you actually are, but about what others believe you to be capable of becoming. The breakthrough came during a period of political chaos when the established order was crumbling and people were desperate for anyone who could provide stability and direction. While traditional leaders squabbled over territory and titles, our protagonist was quietly building something far more valuable, a reputation for getting results. The first real test of their emerging power came when a regional dispute threatened to escalate into full-scale warfare. Both sides had exhausted their diplomatic options and violence seemed inevitable. It was then that this unlikely mediator stepped forward, offering to negotiate a resolution that everyone else had deemed impossible. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Our protagonist arrived at the negotiation not as a supplicant begging for peace, but as someone who radiated an authority that neither side could quite explain or dismiss. They had learned to use their distinctive appearance as a psychological advantage. People were so focused on trying to understand what they were looking at that they forgot to maintain their usual defensive postures. The negotiation techniques they employed were revolutionary for their time. Instead of trying to find middle ground between opposing positions, they reframed the entire conflict in terms that made both sides realize they were fighting over the wrong things entirely. They demonstrated an understanding of human motivation that was so profound, so accurate, that hardened warriors found themselves nodding in agreement before they realized what was happening. But the real masterstroke was how they handled the moment when one of the negotiators tried to dismiss them based on their appearance. Instead of becoming defensive, our protagonist smiled and said something that would be quoted for generations afterward. They suggested that perhaps their unusual features were exactly what was needed, that conventional-looking leaders had created this mess, so maybe it was time to try someone who saw the world differently. The peace that followed wasn't just a temporary ceasefire, it was a transformation of the entire regional power structure. Both sides had been so impressed by the negotiation process that they began seeking our protagonist's counsel on other matters. Word spread quickly about this unusual figure who could solve problems that had stumped everyone else. The rise to actual political power happened faster than anyone could have predicted. As more conflicts were resolved and more impossible situations were somehow made manageable, people began to see our protagonist not as a curiosity to be mocked, but as a resource to be treasured. The same features that had once marked them as an outcast now became symbols of wisdom and supernatural insight. The coronation ceremony was unlike anything in recorded history. Here was someone ascending to the highest position of authority precisely because of the qualities that should have disqualified them according to conventional thinking. The crowd that gathered wasn't just witnessing a political transition, they were watching the complete inversion of their society's most fundamental assumptions about power and worth. What made their rule truly extraordinary wasn't just the dramatic rise to power, but what they accomplished once they got there. They implemented policies that seemed to come from a completely different understanding of human nature and social organization. Crime rates plummeted not because of harsher punishments, but because they created systems that addressed the root causes of desperation and conflict. Trade flourished under their leadership because they understood that prosperity required trust, and trust required leaders who kept their word regardless of personal cost. They built alliances that lasted for generations because they never promised what they couldn't deliver and always delivered more than they promised. Perhaps most remarkably, they created a court culture where differences were celebrated rather than hidden. People who had spent their lives feeling like outsiders suddenly found themselves welcomed and valued for their unique perspectives. The palace became a place where innovation thrived because unconventional thinking was rewarded rather than punished. The legacy they left behind wasn't just about one person's remarkable journey from ridicule to respect. It was about fundamentally changing how an entire society understood the relationship between appearance and ability, between conformity and leadership, between being different and being powerful. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest leaders are those who never fit the mold in the first place. They teach us that what makes us different isn't something to overcome, it's something to weaponize, to transform into our greatest strength. In a world that often demands conformity, they proved that the courage to be authentically yourself isn't just personally liberating, it can be historically transformative. The bearded queen's rise from mockery to majesty shows us that power isn't inherited or granted. It's earned by those brave enough to turn their deepest vulnerabilities into their most formidable weapons. And that lesson remains as relevant today as it was centuries ago when one extraordinary person looked in a mirror, embraced what they saw, and changed the world forever.